Most people, I think, will be familiar with Ibn Battuta, but perhaps they're not as familiar with Abu Zayd. Who is Abu Zayd?
Well, Abu Zayd, I've really pulled the wool over people's eyes by talking about a lecture about Ibn Battuta and Abu Zayd, because Ibn Battuta is Ibn Battuta. He's the great traveller, he's the huge character in so many ways. Abu Zayd was a compiler of these stories from seamen, mostly from merchants who'd lived in the East. He was effectively a compiler. He was sort of a stay-at-home geographer, an armchair traveller. And we know that he existed in reality because, you know, some of the guys we don't know anything about other than their names, because Al-Mas'udi, the great Herodotus of the Arabs, as he's been called, who was himself a traveller, geographer, historian, he bumped into him and actually got some of his choice marvels and mundanities from Abu Zayd. But Abu Zayd was a collector.
Do you think there's a reason why Western authors, or rather why the West is so interested in only Western authors, as opposed to taking the experiences of other authors?
It's something to do with, well, it's obviously to do with where you come from. And obviously where you come from has an effect on how you see things and on how you interpret them to your audience. So, very quick example, Ibn Battuta watches a sati ceremony, a widow burning herself on her husband's funeral pyre in India. And he explains this to his Muslim audience by saying it's amrun mandub, it's a recommended act, but it's not obligatory. And he uses Islamic legal terminology to explain this. So anyone who travels, anyone who writes or tells a travel story is doing a cultural translation. And, you know, obviously Ibn Battuta is doing this for an Islamic audience,
right,
whereas Marco Polo does it for a Christian audience.
Right. It seems to be something that interests you about how the Arab nations are kind of connected in some ways, in different ways.
I think, you know, personally, if I go back to that question, what is an Arab? There are lots of answers, but the kind of biggest answer is it's to do with language. And I think it's to do with language more than it's to do with religion. You know, because of course not all Arabs are Muslims. But the language is something that kind of unites all of them.
You spent 30 years living in Arab countries, particularly in Yemen. I was going to ask you how you felt, how you have observed the last 3 years of the Arab Spring. If you have any thoughts about how it began, or about where it's going, or about the reasons why it happened when it did.
I would say, first of all, that I'm more of a historian than I am a current affairs person. And, you know, I tend to like events to sit a bit and mature and, you know, like a nice cheese in a cellar before I actually taste them and digest them. So I'm not the best person to ask, but what I would say is that I feel maybe the past 30, 40 years before what they call the Arab Spring were a kind of period of, if you like, an age of disappointment. Do you know what I mean? We had all these great hopes in the 60s, and I say we, kind of speaking almost as an adoptive Arab, and the early 70s, you know, we had Nasserism, and the 50s, 60s and 70s were a time of great optimism among the Arabs. And then, you know, we had all these sort of, I heard them called beautifully once, Jamlakiyas, you know, a mixture between a Jumhuriya and a Mamlaka, a republic and a monarchy, you know, all these sort of presidents for life. And, you know, things came to a stop. And the motion that you need to live, to progress through history, effectively came to a stop for these decades. And I'll tell you why I think I say this at the moment. I've recently been rereading, after many years, the poems of Nizar Qabbani, the great late Syrian poet, very famous for his love poems, but he also wrote on politics. And he was writing in the 60s and 70s, he was saying things like, Nuridu Jilan Khadaban, we want an angry generation, a generation who will tear up history from the roots. And all this kind of potential momentum came to a dead stop. And it was not very healthy. And so perhaps what's happened over the past couple of years is something of this inspired spirit coming back. And I think, you know, really without it, without that sense of revolution, and when I say revolution, I don't mean it has to be bloody, and unfortunately it has been. There's so much potential. And, you know, obviously here we have all the oil wealth. I'm not thinking so much of that. I'm thinking of Yemen, where I live, all those millions of al-aidi al-amila, you know, the potential of working hands and working brains. It is such a waste not to move forward. And, you know, we don't have to dismiss the past in a bloody massacre. We just have to look to the future, and we have to have people of vision, not people whose only vision is the throne that they're sitting on and how best to keep it. We need people of vision for the future. And I think possibly we need to look at the younger generation and forget those old guys like, you know, my sort of age.
Very good. I think Tim Mackintosh Smith, we will leave it there.
Thank you very much.